Good afternoon, everybody. We're back with our afternoon session, continuing our symposium on the global Islamophobia in the era of populism. And our afternoon panelists are here, and we're so happy that they're here. We welcome them here today. Islamophobia in Asia, Genocide and Detention. So we have our three panelists here, starting from all the way to my right. We have Engi Abdelkader, we have Audrey Truschke, and we have Asher Gertner. And I'm gonna read their bios before they speak, and we're gonna go in the order of Audrey first, Asher second, and Engi third. So let me introduce, and you all know your timings, and I'll remind you of your timings. I want to start by introducing Professor, let me get my pages together, Audrey Truschke. She is an assistant professor of South Asian history here at Rutgers University, Newark. Well, Newark, but here at Rutgers. Her teaching and her research interests focus on the cultural, imperial, and intellectual history of early modern and modern India. She publishes on cross-cultural exchanges, historical memory, and imperial power. Dr. Truschke wrote a book, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and Aurangzeb, the life and legacy of India's most controversial king. Her current book project is on Sanskrit literary histories of Muslim-led incursions and rule in India. And with that, I'd like to ask Audrey to please come to the podium.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Atiya, for the very kind introduction. A warm welcome to everyone, both the very few people in this incredibly large room. I have never lectured to a room this large and this empty simultaneously. And a warm welcome to everyone who is watching online as well. So sort of heeding one of the calls from the first panel today to think about Islamophobia specifically and in context rather than always sort of, in the general, I'm going to start not with anything about Islam, but rather with something about India, which is with the Indian flag, the Tiranga, the tricolor. This flag has represented the independent nation state of India since 1947, the year in which India gained its independence from Britain after 200 years of colonial rule. The flag is laden with symbolism. Okay, there's sort of multiple overlapping layers here. One layer of that symbolism is religious. Right, so the orange band on top represents Hindus, India's solid majority at nearly 80% today. Green on the bottom represents Muslims who comprise slightly over 14% of modern-day Indians, India's largest religious minority. And then the white in the middle represents everybody else, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and so forth. But what would happen if we took out the white and if we took out the green? Then we would be left with a saffron flag, like the one you see flying here over the saffron imagination of India. This theoretical future India, called the Hindu Rashtra, is championed by Hindu nationalists. And I'll tell you more about Hindu nationalists, who they are and where they come from in just a moment. Now, Hindu nationalists see this saffron-infused India as an ideal. For them, this is a lofty vision of unity. But when I look at maps like this, all I see is the pain and the violent erasure of Muslims and other religious minorities it would take to achieve such shocking homogeneity. Now, while this result may look horrific to my eyes, as I said, it is a desired result by some, namely Hindu nationalists or Hindutva ideologues. And so let me tell you a little bit more about this group of people. So Hindu nationalism, or Hindutva, as it's sometimes called by its proponents, is a political ideology. It's roughly 100 years old. Originally, Hindutva emerged in the early 20th century. It was inspired by fascist movements in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, hence the khaki shorts, the paramilitary emphasis, and more. M.S. Golwalkar, a mid-20th century Hindutva ideologue and the head of the RSS, the largest Hindutva organization of its day and now, he wrote in 1939, and I quote, "Germany purging the country of Semitic races, the Jews, is a good lesson for us in Hindustan to live and profit by." That is an astonishing and a terrifying thing to say in 1939, on the eve of Germany ramping up its death camps. In 1947, an RSS man by the name of Godse assassinated Mahatma Gandhi, India's major independence leader and an inspiration here at home in the US to Martin Luther King Jr. After that murder, Hindutva remained a political ideology that was a pretty severe minority view. No respectable Indian wanted to touch it for decades. But things began to change in the 1980s. And what happened was the birth of the BJP, right? A major political party that champions Hindutva. Today, the BJP rules India. It increasingly defines the Indian mainstream with devastating consequences for Indian Muslims. Today, I want to share with you 3 recent examples, all from within the last 6 to 7 months, of how Hindutva ideology has resulted in the displacement and or the disciplining of Indian Muslims with the goal that those Muslims would become more compliant with Hindu majoritarian norms. So let me start with Kashmir. In August of 2019, the Indian government, led by the Hindu nationalist Narendra Modi, revoked Article 370 of the Indian Constitution and thereby stripped Kashmir of its semi-autonomous status. Now, Kashmir, you can see it on the map on my slide here. It's a region between India and Pakistan. It was once known for its beauty. It is now the most heavily militarized region in the entire world. Given the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that is a sort of extraordinary thing. Now, Kashmir has been disputed for more than 7 decades. It has led to 3 wars between India and Pakistan already. India-controlled Kashmir is India's only majority Muslim state. Now, the stripping of Kashmir's autonomy through the revocation of Article 370 fundamentally changed the relationship between Kashmir and the Indian nation. It gave up the pretense that India would ever allow self-determination on the part of the Kashmiri people. Now, that had been a pretense, and a pretense only for some time, but even the pretense is gone now. India, by the way, did agree to self-determination on the part of Kashmiris back in 1948. It was accompanied by a series of other measures that were designed to control information, including a communications blackout for 7 months. During those 7 months, there was no internet, there was no cell service, no independent journalists were allowed in, politicians were detained, and schools and shops were largely closed. On a personal level, think about the cost of this. People outside of Kashmir didn't know if their family within Indian-controlled Kashmir, if they were still alive, if they had died, who had been born, what was happening. For those inside of Kashmir, there were few to no options for communicating with the outside world. Several months into the communications blackout, one thing that happened that sort of caught the eye of some journalists is that Kashmiris started disappearing en masse from their family WhatsApp groups because WhatsApp deletes inactive users after a certain number of days. So imagine not knowing how your family's doing or if they're even still alive, and then suddenly overnight they vanish from your WhatsApp group. Imagine being the person who vanishes. On a global informational level, we do not really know what happened in these 7 months. We had a trickle of information that came out of Kashmir, and it suggested widespread human rights abuses, including detentions and beatings of children. Now, the internet blockade was lifted about a week ago, last Thursday, with a couple of key caveats. One, the internet is really slow in Kashmir, okay? The government's sort of tamping it down that way. 2, the Indian government is openly tracking all internet users in Kashmir, right? They're not even pretending that they're not tracking people. They're just saying straight up, we are tracking everyone. And 3, in a very Orwellian move, the Indian government has unveiled already new textbooks that talk about the revocation of Article 370 without mentioning the communications blockade, the internet shutdowns, or mass arrests. They are brazenly rewriting history that literally happened last week. Now, the Indian government is crystal clear that it wants the land of Kashmir, but it seems to have little use for Kashmiris, who are overwhelmingly Muslim. One goal of the abrogation of Article 370 is that it will allow Indians to move into Kashmir and to buy property there, something that they were prevented from doing previously. So what we could see is an internal displacement going forward, somewhat similar to how we've seen China act towards Tibet, for example, over the last couple of decades. But what if this takes a darker turn? Violence and even genocide are not beyond the realm of the possible in India right now, as other recent events have demonstrated. And this brings me to my second example. In mid-December of 2019, the BJP-led government in India unveiled and passed into law the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, which provides a fast track to Indian citizenship for all religious groups except Muslims. The BJP also announced that they would conduct an India-wide National Register of Citizens, the NRC, which forces all those living within Indian borders to prove their citizenship using documents or else be stripped of that citizenship and be rendered stateless. Now, many Indians simply don't have documents like birth certificates and things like that, so they will become non-citizens through the NRC. But everyone can then fast-track themselves back into Indian citizenship through the CAA, except for Muslims. This means that when working together, the CAA and the NRC will strip many Indian Muslims of their citizenship for years, maybe permanently. And I want to underscore that we know this for 3 reasons. 1, we can work out the logic. I just described that to you, and it's represented by this admittedly somewhat simplified graphic on the slide. 2, BJP politicians have openly said that they will not deprive Hindus or anybody of citizenship except Muslims or, quote, infiltrators, in the words of Amit Shah, the most powerful man in the BJP. So the BJP leaders have sort of tipped their hand on this point. Last, we've seen a test run of what will happen in Assam. This is a state in northeastern India which has already undergone the NRC and now plans to put many Muslims in camps. Many journalists have reported on these concentration camps that are already under construction. Most recently, John Oliver, who did such a damning episode that the entire episode has been censored and is unavailable in India. For many Indians, a nationwide CAA and NRC proposed by the BJP simply went too far. And so protests began also in December of 2019. The protests have been all over India, in various cities, and they have involved notably large sections of the Indian population. Some of the most sustainable are female-led. My favorite genre of protest signs, by the way, have been these. And I'm sorry for those sitting in the audience who can't see these. All right? My single favorite sign is the guy saying, "It's so bad, here with my ex," right? The one I personally identify with the most is, "It's so bad, even the parents are here." There have been great moments of hope in these protests, including their longevity, that it's really a broad-based pushback, and that some are female-led. But the protests have not altered the course of the Indian state. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, Hindu nationalists unleashed notable violence on Indian Muslims with strong complicity from the Indian state. And this is my 3rd example, what we are now calling the February 2020 pogrom in Delhi. So in late February, while United States President Donald Trump visited India, Hindu mobs unleashed widespread violence against Muslim communities in Northeast Delhi. We are still totaling the numbers, and maybe we will never know all of them for sure, but here are a few. 14 mosques were damaged. Many Muslim-owned shops were burnt. Some Muslims left Delhi altogether. The current death toll stands at 53. That's almost certainly being undercounted still. There have been 0 visits from Prime Minister Modi and no relief from the state to those affected. Now, the point of this violence and the subsequent callous dismissal of it was to punish Muslims for pushing back against the CAA, right? For resisting the Hindu Rashtra. It was also designed to instill fear in Muslim communities and secondarily in their allies as a deterrent for future resistance. And in this, it was probably successful. One thing that happened during the riots is this. A member of one of these Hindu mobs climbed atop the minaret of a mosque, and he put up a saffron flag of Hanuman, one of the Hindu gods. He thus marked a Muslim religious space as subservient to Hindu majoritarian norms and specifically to a Hindu deity. The mob later set this very same mosque on fire and damaged it. A few days later, another Hindu man climbed atop the same minaret, and he removed the saffron Hanuman flag. Now, this second man was hailed as a hero, and rightly so. It is crucial that Indian Hindus push back against the hateful agenda of Hindu nationalism that is seeking, among other things, to hijack their religious tradition and reduce it to a violent political ideology. And we are seeing increasing pushback, both in India and in the United States, including most recently on American college campuses against Hindutva, led by Indian students. To go back to the second man who removed the flag, I give him immense credit for his bravery. He did a great thing. I also want to point out that only a Hindu could have done this in the current Indian environment. If a Muslim had tried to remove the flag, he might not have lived to tell the tale. Indian Muslims are living to a great degree within a Hindu Rashtra already, where they are being increasingly denied a voice and authority over even their religious affairs. As of now, India is continuing down a very dangerous path of authoritarianism, fascism, and rampant Islamophobia. Despite everything that I have described to you, and my colleague Asher will tell you even more, nobody in the Indian government has paid any price for any of this. No heads have rolled, no state-led truth commissions, no resignations, no suspensions. India is turning saffron, and saffron alone, it seems, before our very eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tresky. It was heavy. Also want to encourage anyone who's here in our small audience, as well as those who are watching us over the internet, to post any questions that you have. We'll have a question and answer period at the end of the three presentations. I would like to ask, let me first read his bio. Professor Asher Gertner, who is an associate professor of geography and the director of the South Asian Studies program here at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. His long-term ethnographic research is in informal settlements in Delhi, culminated in his book, Rule by Aesthetics, World-Class City Making in Delhi, a study of mass displacement, bourgeois environmentalism, and the aesthetic politics of defining who belongs and who doesn't belong in the world-class city of Delhi. He is the co-editor of Future-Proof Security Aesthetics in the Management of Life and the forthcoming book, Land Fictions, The Commodifications of Land in the City and the Country. And with that, if I could ask Dr. Gertner to come to the podium.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers for hosting this event. It's my pleasure to be here. So I'm an urban geographer. I'll be talking today about infrastructures of Muslim exclusion in India. I've long been studying sociospatial segregation in Indian cities. While the previous presentations today in the earlier panels and just preceding my own have, I think, brilliantly explored the ideological, political, historical, and legal logics of Islamophobia, I'd like to turn in a slightly different direction for my time today. I'm interested specifically in how anti-Muslim violence combines with entrenched patterns of spatial segregation to produce physical and symbolic infrastructures of Muslim exclusion in contemporary India. I want to do so following an approach that sees infrastructures as both the physical systems that mediate material relations between people and things, as well as the spatial coding that governs the distributions of resources and values unevenly within society. Infrastructure, in this sense, consists of pipes, power lines, roads, and buildings, but also the socio-material basis for citizenship. That is, how people's networked relations give them the capacity to assert social belonging, or that deny them that same capacity. This builds on an approach in geography, my own discipline, that sees citizenship as a material relation and not just a legal or a political one. In this sense, citizenship is a system that has to be maintained. Like any infrastructure, it requires care, lest it crumble or break down. What I want to do today is point to the struggle to maintain the material basis of citizenship in urban India. And what I want to, suggest is that the current legal threat to Muslim citizenship that Audrey Trishke just mentioned in her presentation has been undergoing a longer material breakdown. And I'm going to begin with a place called Shaheen Bagh, a place in Delhi one encounters today as a broad, trafficless street that straddles the boundary between the capital city of Delhi and the suburb called Noida. You can see it in the star on the map shown on the screen, hopefully. If you turn past the main road skirting Shaheen Bagh and manage to squirm past numerous police barricades winding through the narrow alleyways there, you'll observe a unique phenomenon, what some have called the single most powerful form of citizenship struggle taking place since Indian independence. While an almost impenetrable wall of men skirting them exists, thousands of Muslim women, some as old as 85 years old, sit underneath a makeshift tent, often with their children cradled in their laps, one eye on a wandering toddler and another towards the stage on which activists deliver their cries of justice and songs of peace. They've been there for 90 days. They sit in protest, most of them 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, because the current government has compelled them to sleep on the streets, they say. Because there's nothing else left for them to do, they lament. Because their children need them, and because they'd rather die than be anywhere else, they proclaim. This is Shaheen Bagh. It all began on December 15th last year when the Delhi police broke into Jamia Millia Islamia University, one of India's most premier institutions, and brutally assaulted students who were peacefully protesting the National Register of Citizens and the Citizenship Amendment Act. The student body of Jamia and the Teachers Association earlier that same day had condemned scattered incidents of violence that had taken place elsewhere in the city and affirmed that students or faculty were in no way involved with those incidents. Nevertheless, later that evening, hundreds of police officers forcefully entered the campus without the university administration's approval. They used batons and tear gas on the protesters, detaining nearly 100 students and injuring around 200. 2 students were shot in the mix. Now, I'm going to show a video from this, if I can get it to work. And I want you to just imagine, those of you that are in New Jersey or in US campuses or any campus environment really, imagine what this would look like had it been your students studying in a library at their kiosks. Oh, it's not playing, sorry. Is it playing? Okay, good. So I don't want to downplay the significance of the direct bodily violence the police wreaked on a mostly Muslim student population in this and similar incidents. This demands our highest condemnation. What I want to point to is the aftermath of this and the specifics of how we might see it as attack on a key infrastructure of secular learning, a symbol of Muslim urbanity, a symbol, as Dr. Zakir Hussain, one of Jamia's founders, put it, for education and cultural renaissance, and for the promotion of the national integration of Indian Muslims who will be proud to take part in the future progress of India. Jamia represents an India where Indian Muslims are integral to the national body. The batons that crash down on Muslim student bodies represent an assault on that very model. CCTV footage, as you can see here, released last month, shows police and paramilitary personnel entering the library and randomly beating up students. Another video showed the police breaking the door of the postgraduate reading room, where students pleaded with the police not to hurt them. The police brutality and vandalism continued, however, with Jamia estimating that 26 million rupees worth of damage took place. The library remained closed for 3 months after. This is an example of what I'd like us to think of as infrastructural violence, an attack on the vital systems sustaining a space of Muslim education and urbanity. Now let's see if I can get back to my own images. Is it up? Yeah. Similar attacks took place 3 weeks later at Jawaharlal Nehru University when a 100-strong mob entered campus, breaking doors, smashing windows, trashing students' books and belongings, and raiding for over a 3-hour period 7 different student hostels, delivering a serious form of chaos. After this, a student, Surya Prakash, a blind JNU student, told the New York Times that I feel a phobia now of people coming to kill me when I hear the door bang. We were simply studying. This sense that all spaces of secular dissent, especially those with a visible Muslim presence, are under attack has led to new models of solidarity and new infrastructures of care. They lead us back to Shaheen Bagh. The round-the-clock protest there began when a small group of women connected to Jamia called their sisters onto the street to join them in peaceful protest. Saima Khan, a 33-year-old woman who helped organize the communications for this otherwise leaderless movement, told the journalist, "After Jamia, there's no more fear in our hearts. There's no future for our children now. Our lives are meaningless except for Shaheen Bagh." From the bare existence of living community on the streets has emerged a platform for something much more. This something more begins from the transformation of women's everyday care work into a new infrastructure of secular care. The tasks of keeping children at hand, preparing meals, and tidying the home, normally carried out as introverted, private affairs, have now been turned into the public sphere, becoming far more extroverted. Shaheen Bagh has grown into a form of self-provisioning of sorts. If the old secularism was one that was often ridiculed for relying on the national accommodation of religious minorities, then something else seems to be work here. Secularism here is the social reproductive labor of Muslim women who now sit front and center under the Indian flag. This is a secularism in which Muslim women are dynamic agents, not passive recipients of state beneficence, as they're often depicted to be. The love they show toward their families now spills out for their country in the songs they sing throughout the night. They hold interfaith prayers. They formed a community kitchen. They established a blanket depot for those visiting from afar to survive Delhi's frigid winters. When a caravan of buses from the state of Punjab carrying 600 Sikh farmers arrived and was blocked by the police, Shaheen Bagh members first fired up their makeshift kitchen, then escorted members from the buses to the site, laying out bedrolls for travelers to rest, providing them with hot meals, and opening the mosque for them to bathe. This is part of what I mean by a kind of social infrastructure for a new secularism in India. An arrangement's been made outside the tent for offering namaz. Iftar is also offered here for fasting women. On one day, owners of a restaurant might bring biryani to serve people. Another day, a meat trader will bring provisions. The police on duty are also offered biryani and kebabs, even though they're often trying to block those very food deliveries that are sustaining the people. A library has been created on the street, as well as an open-air art gallery. What I want to point out, too, is the fact that these makeshift infrastructures are impressive not only because they have sustained thousands of people for 90 continuous days. They also produce a makeshift community of sorts, one that prefigures, I would argue, a dream of a renewed Indian citizenship not defined by identity papers or religion. This might be an example of what feminist theorists and geographers are thinking of as a practice of feminist commoning, right? Where the commons is something we typically think of as a sort of resource sharing system, a system of self-management. There's been a move towards emphasizing commoning as an active process of community making, right? It's not just a discrete unit, but it's a performance, it's a practice, it's a set of what I've been calling maintenance work. Whereas feminist commoning is a specific form of cultivating the everyday practices, social relations, and spaces of creativity and social reproduction where people come, share, and act together. This is what I would suggest we're seeing at work in Shaheen Bagh, driven by women leaders. The remedial work of infrastructure provisioning, carrying water, running backup generators, pooling kitchen resources, are not incidental to a place like Shaheen Bagh. In other words, it's not just random that it's taking place here. They rather should be seen specifically as part of a learned practice of overcoming structural forms of Muslim marginalization. They are a spatial claim that we are here, we belong, and thus they are a challenge to the spatial relegation and the infrastructural exclusion that Muslims have increasingly faced in India over the past 30 years. In other words, it's a way of making do that involves doing better for others around you. To see how this makes sense, I want to just point you to the larger locality within which Shaheen Bagh is positioned. As you can see from the Google map here, it's part of a wider region called Jamia Nagar. This was a barely populated grasslands area until the mid-1980s. You can see Jamia Millia Islamia University at the top half of the map, and Shaheen Bagh is this small neighborhood within Jamia Nagar. After the 1984 anti-Sikh riots that took place in Delhi, Jamia Nagar grew rapidly as Muslims fled other areas, fearing that they would be subject to the same kinds of violence. After the controversial demolition of the Babri Masjid in Uttar Pradesh in 1992, the Muslim population of the area increased still more rapidly through a broader national pattern of Muslim ghettoization, enacted through real estate practices that have systematically excluded Muslim homeowners from accessing housing and rental properties in mixed religion neighborhoods. This has led literally to a spatial inscription of difference that has so hardened communal tensions in cities across India. Islamophobia, in this sense, must be seen both as a spatial expression of patterns of segregation and exclusion, but also something that is Islamophobia is also something that's deepened and enhanced by this precise spatial form. Shaheen Bagh, as a result, today, through processes of ghettoization, is a densely populated area with hemmed-in lanes. An image of it is shown on the right, as you can see there. It still has no potable water, despite being a mixed-class neighborhood with plenty of middle and upper-middle-class Muslim occupants, including Jamia professors. And it also has no government school. The image on the left you see is of people queuing up to gain access to piped to water that's tanked in because it's not otherwise available. Every year, the lack of adequate drainage in this area due to municipal neglect and infrastructural disconnect means that the streets and homes flood with sewage water due to monsoon rains. Residents manually clean out pipes and physically remove the waste that accumulates. This is a story, in other words, of systematic disinvestment from a space where Muslim families and renters have been relegated. This is common, indeed, in Muslim-majority neighborhoods in urban India, places that are often referred by the media as Chote Pakistans or Little Pakistans. This specific language was actually directly invoked by Kapil Mishra, a BJP leader, who wrote in a tweet, as you can see on your screen here, that Pakistan has entered Shaheen Bagh. Many Pakistans are being created in Delhi. The Indian law is not allowed to enter. This idea of Muslim neighborhoods as territorially different, anti-national, through their association with Pakistan, spaces that exclude the entry of Indian law, makes the withdrawal of state services to those areas legitimate. It seems like a logical implication. And this has been precisely the aim of the Delhi police, who have set up a blockade around the protesters to cut off access to Shaheen Bagh, to infrastructurally disconnect the protest from wider networks in the city. A sister Shaheen Bagh, now there have been many sort of copycat Shaheen Baghs that have popped up all over India in solidarity with this main protest. One in the state of Maharashtra faced unannounced power cuts as another example of the attempt to infrastructurally disconnect the types of provisional infrastructures here, modeling a new secular India. The traffic blockage that became a pointed object of dispute in the judiciary and in the popular media, specifically by middle-class residents, Hindu residents, claiming that their daily lives were being disrupted, was blamed on the protests for the road blockades. But when a petition in the Supreme Court led to an investigation, the Supreme Court investigator found that the traffic had actually been caused by the police themselves, who, it was claimed, quote, wrongly laid blame on the protest for these wider urban disruptions. The protesters themselves had specifically confirmed that they were acting in the public interest by putting up a sign, as you can see here, saying we are specifically open to facilitating ambulance and emergency service access, notably services that had historically been denied from their own area. Right? Ambulances that don't show up despite people being sick, and here they're going out of their way to ensure that these very services are provided. All of this, I think, these Delhi blockades, the police blockades, like the attack on the Jamia Library earlier, ought to be seen, I think, as an attempt at what geographers call herbicide. Herbicide, for those of you that can't see the slide, not with an H, as in the killing of weeds in a garden, but urban, or URB-icide, herbicide, a particular formation of purposive violence, Stephen Graham argues, where urbanity itself is the strategic object of assault. That is, this is a killing of the vital infrastructures that sustain urban community. Here, a life in common that shows India to be more than identity papers. Herbicide is a term pointing to the linked forms of structural and physical violence that take place through the asymmetric destruction of urban space. This could be things like the Russian targeted bombings of Syrian hospitals and Kurdish strongholds. It could be things like the systematized and unrestricted destruction of homes that exceed plausible military necessity in a place like Palestine. And it could be things like the state's disinvestment from municipal water supply in a city like Flint, Michigan, leading to rampant lead contamination. These all stand as models of herbicide, and I would argue that the forms of Muslim marginalization and disconnect that we see taking place today also fit this model. The Delhi riots, the mass disproportionate violence against Muslim neighborhoods that took place just in the past weeks, I think are another example of this. 250 homes suffering massive catastrophic damage, as you can see here. More than 300 shops gutted and destroyed. In the area of Gokulpuri, a Muslim cemetery was destroyed and defaced, a form of symbolic violence of the highest order. While the police, despite being in the police station being stationed right adjacent to the cemetery, was sort of stood by watching, as they'd done in the examples of university attacks as well. In the wake of this particular violence, this mass violence in northeastern Delhi and other Muslim majority neighborhoods in Delhi, prompted indeed by the inflammatory speech of current ruling party leaders, I think it's useful to note that what's fallen out is another form of Islamophobia, a new sort of renewed type of fear. In the wake of this violence, this neighborhood violence, this deep form of herbicide, I would argue, against Muslim neighborhoods, what we've seen is that neighbors have begun to set up metal sheets, bamboo poles, wooden boards as barricades dividing Hindu from Muslim neighborhoods. The violence, again seemingly provoked by a BJP party leader, must hence be seen as an attempt to reproduce a segregated public sphere. If Islamophobia gets spatialized through religious segregation, then the endurance of everyday forms of infrastructure, witnessed in Shaheen Bagh, infrastructures that hold communities together, must be understood as a spatial claim, I would argue, to citizenship. A spatial project of denying the majoritarian claim that it is us versus them, that it is nationalists versus anti-nationalists, that it's Hindus versus Muslims. Unfortunately, the violence that we see going on today is an attempt to overcome that and reproduce old segregationist logics, and I hope that we all can stand against that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gentner. We'll move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Angie Abdelkader, who's an attorney and part-time lecturer here at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her teaching and research explores religion, race, and gender at the intersection of law, politics, and society, both domestically as well as internationally. She has dedicated her career to advancing social justice issues, from religious freedom and racial equality to the rights of immigrants, women, and children. She has collaborated with the UN, U.S. State Department, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the American Bar Association, among others. Her writings have appeared in CNN, the HuffPost, Time, and Christian Science Monitor, and other numerous outlets. And with that, if I could have Angie up here.
So thank you so much for that introduction, Ataya. I'm happy to be here, and I've been asked to actually discuss the crisis facing the Uyghur Muslims in China. Those of you who have my classes, whether on an undergraduate or graduate level, are familiar with this particular religious and ethnic minority group based in the northwest region of China, because we've spent quite a bit of time in the past several years studying them as case studies in various contexts, whether in the context of counterterrorism and democracy, or in the context of classes exploring racism, intolerance, and xenophobia. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Uyghurs, they are, as I mentioned, a religious and ethnic minority group based in China of Turkic ancestry. They practice a moderate Sunni version of Islam. And I personally first heard of the Uyghurs in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attack, so almost 20 years ago. Immediately following the September 11th terrorist attacks, the U.S. attacked the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces in Afghanistan. In what it considered to be a non-traditional war, President Bush signed a military order that implemented new procedures designating the capture and interrogation of what would be enemy combatants. This was thought to prevent new additional attacks by allowing military officials to interrogate these individuals caught on enemy battlefields. This eventually led to the capture and detention of 500 so-called enemy combatants who were detained at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Among those were 24 Uyghurs who were captured by bounty hunters in Pakistan and turned over to U.S. military forces for a cash reward. In time, the Uyghurs were cleared of any terrorist-related activities and reclassified as, quote, non-enemy combatants. The question, of course, is, and the reason why I bring it up in this context, is what were the Uyghur detainees doing in Pakistan in the first instance? The fact is that they had fled persecution, long-standing persecution and mistreatment in their native China. In truth, after the U.S. cleared the Uyghur detainees, China demanded their repatriation. But the U.S. refused to do so, consistent with the international legal principle of non-refoulement. The principle is grounded in international human rights law, and it states that individuals should not be returned to countries where they will likely face torture, cruelty, inhumane, and degrading treatment. While China's deplorable human rights violations of the Uyghurs' civil, political, cultural, and economic rights has received considerable attention in the press domestically as well as internationally as of late, much of the authoritarian state's practices are actually part of a long-standing pattern of abuses. And for that reason, I start with some historical context. What is known today as Xinjiang of the Uyghur Autonomous Region, located in northwest China, has been variously ruled by Mongols, the Turks, the Russians, the Chinese, as well as Uyghur nationals themselves. Ultimately, in the 1950s, the region fell under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. It became part of the People's Republic of China, but it still remained religiously, ethnically, culturally, and linguistically distinctive. And this is because the majority of the population in that region was in fact the Uyghur Muslims. Over time, the communist government began persecuting religious groups, including the Uyghurs. For instance, with respect to this Muslim minority group, they closed their Islamic schools. They destroyed their religious texts. And they also converted mosques into offices. In addition, much like what was happening around the same time in Myanmar, also known as Burma, Uyghur officials were stripped of their government positions, and those positions instead were given to members of the Han ethnic group. The Hans, by way of background, constitute the majority ethnic group in China, almost 95 to 98%. Although the Uyghurs constituted the majority population at this time in Xinjiang, the Han dismantled their social institutions and took control of the local economy. Beginning in the 1950s, Beijing also started a Han migration initiative, promoting Han immigration to the Uyghur Autonomous Region, which is rich with mineral, gas, and oil reserves. They did this to establish control over the region. This would also help dilute the minority group's distinctive cultural, religious, and linguistic character. Today, the Han constitute 40% of the autonomous region, compared to only 6% when the migration policies were first instituted. The Uyghurs comprise about 45% today. While migration resulted in positive economic growth for that region, it's important to note that it was only the Han locals and migrants who benefited economically. The Uyghurs suffered socially, politically, and economically. According to Beijing, the Uyghurs experience what they characterize as identity confusion. This is largely because they are ethnically similar to the Turkic people in Central Asia rather than the Han majority in Beijing. Beijing views national identity and unity as being intimately linked with the Han ethnic identity. The Han identity is viewed by officials as the glue keeping the country together geographically and demographically. Rather than accommodating differences, Beijing expects ethnic minorities such as the Uyghurs to assimilate and become part of the Han cultural identity. In essence, the Uyghurs' ethnic, religious, and cultural distinctiveness here has traditionally been viewed by Beijing as a threat to national unity. Religion isn't a matter of ideology or even spirituality to Beijing. Rather, it is a means of social control. It either undermines or upholds the state's sovereignty. And insofar as the Uyghur Muslims are concerned, their relationship with God is seen as a threat to the nation's atheistic nature. In the 1990s, segments of the Uyghur community responded to Beijing's attempt to displace them culturally, ethnically, and economically. They did so with a separatist movement. The movement desired independence from Beijing. In response, the Chinese Communist government adapted a heavy-handed approach, summed up by the quote-unquote strike hard campaign. This campaign allowed officials to silence political dissent as well as clamp down on religious activity. In response, some Uyghurs chose to flee China, resettling in Pakistan and Afghanistan. In the aftermath of the September 11 terrorist attacks, Beijing began to adapt the discourse of the, quote, war on terror. Whereas the Uyghurs were previously characterized largely as, quote unquote, separatists, now Chinese officials label them as, quote unquote, terrorists. China identified itself as a victim in an international terrorist plot and deemed the Uyghur population the equivalent of Al-Qaeda. Over the years, China attributed a number of terrorist plots to the Uyghur people. But many in the international community believed that the reports were exaggerated and pretextual, just to justify repressive policies targeting the group. Today, the Chinese government continues to prioritize the elimination of Uyghur culture while conflating Islamic practices with violent extremism. It's adopted a spectrum of laws, policies, and practices to achieve a more unified China. Four of the primary techniques include re-education camps, sophisticated surveillance systems, restrictions on religious freedom, and a strike hard campaign silencing dissidents. I'll speak regarding each tactic separately. First, regarding surveillance. Xinjiang has been made into a 21st century police state because the government uses repressive force to control all aspects of Uyghur life. This includes policing tactics like roadblocks and checkpoints. It includes cutting-edge technology that constantly monitors the Uyghur population. It includes police who are stationed everywhere, including shops and restaurants. It includes 6-person teams of police going house to house, collecting information and asking questions such as, what faith does your family practice and how often do you pray every day? The government uses the most technologically sophisticated, pervasive digital surveillance software in the world to monitor the movement of the minority Uyghur people. Uyghurs can be arrested and jailed if they are found with cell phones that do not contain specific monitoring applications that allow the government to track their every move. The government also uses DNA databases, facial and voice recognition software to ensure effective surveillance of the minority group in the Xinjiang region. Second, in addition to surveillance, the government has continued its quote-unquote strike hard policy. This campaign began in the 1990s, and it continues today. It includes raids, for example, in Uyghur neighborhoods that are designed to secure literature, music, religious texts, and any materials teaching any of these subjects within that population. But perhaps the most effective tactic that the Chinese officials use to eliminate the Uyghurs' cultural and religious distinctiveness are the re-education camps. Today, approximately 1 million Uyghurs are interned in these camps. According to news reports, internees have been tortured, neglected, and mistreated. Inside, there are restrictions on bathing, as well as their ability to engage in religious ablutions. They are required to sing songs praising the Communist Party. They are tested on their knowledge of Mandarin. They are required to denounce their own culture and religion. They are prohibited from engaging in any religious practices. And they are required to engage in forced labor. There are reports that a number of internees have engaged in suicidal ideation. Lastly, Beijing continues to engage in violations of the Uyghurs' right to religious freedom. Officials cut the skirts and the long shirts of Uyghur Muslim women, for example, on local streets because they're too modest. Authorities prohibit beards and religious attire in places of public accommodation. If a Uyghur refuses to watch TV, it's now considered a crime. Evidence of extreme religious views include abstaining from alcohol, refusing to eat pork, fasting during the holy month of Ramadan. Notably, all of these practices are consistent with Orthodox Muslim teachings. And so essentially the message from Beijing is that to be Muslim is to be a religious fundamentalist and a threat to national security. In response to international criticism, China asserts defenses sounding in its sovereignty and cultural relativism. Essentially, it argues, this is our country, this is a domestic matter, mind your own business. It also claims that it has a right to preserve and protect the cultural practices within its territory. They have used economic and political influence to silence state actors who benefit from their trade agreements. As a result, the United States has been the most vocal and consistent source of condemnation on this score. To be sure, China's practices violate human rights enshrined in multiple international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Representative rights include religious freedom, the right to take part in cultural life, the prohibition on torture, forced labor, the right to liberty and security of person, the right to freedom of movement, and the right to privacy, among others. But again, China's response is consistently the same. It's largely one of denial. So how do we address the human rights violations that are so pervasive in Xinjiang today, given the current geopolitical realities that confront us? Interest convergence theory may provide some insight. Coined by Harvard Law professor Derek Bell, it asserts that minority populations only achieve civil rights or human rights by victories when their interests converge with majority interests. Professor Bell, who's now passed on, initially theorized that such victories were possible in a context of confronting anti-Black racism. But since he initially introduced this theory, it translates into so many more contexts, including this one of international human rights. Insofar as Beijing is concerned with protecting national unity, security, stability, and strength, it's important to understand how its deplorable human rights record undermines those very goals. To root out violent extremism, China has identified, albeit pretextually, an internal cultural and religious threat. For them, that threat is the Uyghur population. This is unfortunately somewhat consistent with the traditional countering violent extremism narratives and approaches that have emanated in a post-9/11 context. For years, we've seen that violent extremism was largely associated with religion, specifically the Islamic faith tradition, and understood primarily vis-a-vis that lens. This is largely because terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS have in fact justified their atrocities by citing to the Islamic faith tradition. But there's been a paradigm shift in recent years, and this is reflected in an international strategy plan published by the United Nations 4 years ago in 2016. That international plan identified 5 primary drivers of violent extremism: discrimination and marginalization, the lack of socioeconomic opportunities, poor governance and a reprehensible human rights record, a protracted, unresolved conflict, and lastly, radicalization in prisons. Notably, in the instant context, 4 of those 5 drivers of extremism, violent extremism, are in fact present. In the interest of self-preservation, in the interest of national unity, of national security, and national strength, it behooves the Chinese government, it behooves Beijing to revisit its approach to the Uyghur population. Lastly, in light of the fact that this conference is focused on Islamophobia in a global context, I'd like to take a moment to actually identify and discuss some overarching themes that are common, a common thread to both American Islamophobia, European Islamophobia, which will be discussed in the panel following this one, as well as Islamophobia in Asia and Southeast Asia, such as in Burma. The first is this question of national identity. We saw in the context of China that national identity is restricted to those who are forced to assimilate with the majority Han cultural identity. Essentially, the question is, what does it mean to be Chinese? And the response that Beijing provides is that you must identify with the Han majority culture. And the same question arises in a European context as well as an American context. What does it mean to be a French person, a French citizen? And oftentimes the response is, it's an individual who does not wear hijab, who is not identifiably Muslim. Similarly, we are engaged in a culture war here in the United States, where some among us define America in strict white Christian terms. And so the construction of national identity is a common theme in each of these contexts, as there are tensions surrounding multiculturalism. Second, another overarching theme in each of these 3 contexts is the discourse surrounding terrorism. Terrorism is repeatedly misused to justify civil rights and human rights violations in American context, in European context, as well as in an Asian context. And this has varying sociological effects, from the way children are treated, to discrimination in employment, to hate crimes. This is another common theme. Finally, I'll end on this note, which is it's important to realize that when a state actor engages in human rights violations, it invariably has a ripple effect throughout the rest of the world. Sometimes we may learn of a humanitarian or human rights crisis facing a particular religious or ethnic minority group in one part of the world, and we sort of shrug our shoulders because it's just Burma, it's just China, it's just the French, without recognizing that allowing for that impunity to occur results in similar violations arising in geographically diverse regions of the world, because a strong message is sent that this is acceptable behavior, even though it's not. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. If we have any questions, I guess we'll get them via magic of internet and the humans running the internet. So if there are any questions, if you could pass them forward. This comment that Angie, you ended on, the ripple around the world is quite fascinating, because we are here with an empty audience because of the ripple of coronavirus, which has gone around the world. So if anyone thinks they live in isolation, they certainly do not live in isolation. Do you want to start off with conversation about the Muslims in India? So this question could be either for Asher or for Audrey. I think it's worth noting, and I'm not sure if it was mentioned or not, but in terms of Muslim population in the world, the second largest country with Muslim population is India. And even though it's only about 10-11% of the Indian population, so a minority, quite a minority in India, it's still one of the second largest number of Muslims in the world. I wanted to know, Audrey or Asher, both of you actually, what your thoughts are on, and this goes all to what Angie just said, the spread, what your thoughts are with respect to the relationship with Modi and Trump visiting particularly Gujarat, and I believe he didn't go anywhere else beyond that, and what that speaks to.
Okay, so I think that the relationship between Modi and Trump is sort of going with the note that Angie ended on, which is sort of this increasing sense that somehow this is acceptable or okay. Under essentially any other recent United States president, America would be pushing back against India, right? We might be doing that depending on the president in different ways, maybe publicly, maybe behind closed doors, maybe through ambassadors, maybe through a well-placed comment, but there would be some sort of pushback by this point. It's especially the impunity that the BJP and Hindu nationalists felt that they could conduct a literal pogrom while Trump was in Delhi. I don't even think. Well, he was in Gujarat, but then he went to Delhi and Agra as well. Okay. So I think that has been really harmful. Right. One thing I would add on a sort of cultural note is Trump did go to Agra during his visit, and of course he went to the Taj Mahal, and he was shown around there by Yogi Adityanath, who is somewhere south of completely insane. He is this totally nutso Hindutva firebrand guy. Yogi Adityanath hates Muslims. He hates the Taj Mahal. His state has cut funding to the Taj Mahal, for example. So you have like two guys who really hate Muslims in their respective countries, one showing the other around the Taj Mahal, one of the most famous buildings in the world, that of course was built by a Muslim king in India in the 17th century.
And is iconic of India. And by far the most visited tourist site in India. And it's a cash cow for the Indian state. The thing brings in a ton of money for the central government. And there's this photo of Trump and Adityanath standing in front of the Taj Mahal, and you can see behind them, on the facade of the Taj, the Arabic calligraphy, which anyone like me who is a Mughal historian knows, of course, that calligraphy are verses from the Quran. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing that Adityanath knew that. He's from India. Seems like he'd know that. But I bet no one had the guts to tell Trump that he was literally photographed with the Quran in the background, right? Mm-hmm. Ironies. Asher, do you want to?
Yeah, I would just add that it seems to me that Trump has played a very useful role in the normalization of the violence that we've been seeing. So that's just to echo Audrey's point. But I just note also that when Modi came into power under his first term, there was a lot of talk and rhetoric specifically about development, the promise of development, the promise of bringing the Gujarat model onto the national stage, where the Gujarat model was seen as one that was promoting rapid industrial growth and job creation. The fear among those who recognized that the Gujarat model also had this element of a Hindu Rashtra embedded within it was that the development model would slide to the wayside, and what would emerge would be this much more violent exclusionary form. That's what I think we're seeing, but some have noted that it's the sort of spectacle of development that allowed the legacies of violence that had taken place in Gujarat, specifically the large 2001 pogrom that happened there under Modi's administration, to kind of become something that was of the past, right? It was a sort of acceptable error in administration rather than a deliberate ideological assault. So we're moving on now. In the context of India witnessing a major slowdown with GDP dipping rapidly, jobs not showing up, real estate sales really dipping, I think Trump basically has provided a similar kind of gloss or a spectacle, right? This president who prides himself on spectacle, the largest rally, this sort of celebration of how many people are going to come and give me flowers and garlands, became a real facade for precisely the violence that was carrying on. So I think that though it's useful just to see the way that promises of international visibility, promises of some symbol of development, even if there's not real economic development taking place, has long served as a screen for the violent ideology that is being spatially enacted in all kinds of really, I think, dangerous ways today.
And to follow up, not all Hindus are Hindutva. Very clearly, Hinduism is a very peaceful religion. The question I have is, when you actually talked about Shaheen Bagh, and you talked about, it's a women's movement primarily. Is it in any way, you mentioned interfaith, is there interfaith activity going on? Okay, so it is.
Yeah, so they've, part of what I was trying to suggest is this new infrastructure for a new model of secularism, which is not my idea. Many journalists have written about this already, is, for example, that this is something that's led by specifically Muslim women that is specifically cultivating a kind of openness to other people to participate that's not defined simply on Muslim exclusion, even though that's the legacy that they're working against, but it's really about a model of secularism that is counter to the Citizen Amendment Act. And so what you see is people from all across Delhi coming there. So there have been thousands of people continuously sitting, but then there's citizens from elsewhere in Delhi who are coming and participating, whether it's for 2 to 3 hour visits, whether it's for overnight stays. I mentioned the case of 8 buses of Punjabi, mostly Sikh men and women who came down and participated. And what you're seeing there, the interfaith is both that there's actual prayers that are interfaith. There's also the kitchens that are opened. There's the Sikh Gurudwara, the place of worship for Sikhs, ran a langar, a shared meal that was for everybody who was participating. So there's this sharing of food, and that's the kind of infrastructural aspect that I think is really important because it cultivates ways of people being together that shows that the divisions that are being promoted are not absolute, that we can overcome them. And it's not only through discourse, it's not only through identification, self-identification or religious identification, but it's through these really material practices. So I think that's what's really impressive and inspiring about it. One of the other things that I think is useful to note is that this fact that it's Muslim women in particular that are front and center, that are expressing their voices, that are claiming agency, is scary for those in power, I think, in all kinds of ways. And I think what we could read is the Delhi riots, the specific incitation of violence by Hindutva male leaders to stop. The idea was to stop protests like Shaheen Bagh taking place elsewhere in Delhi, that this should not continue, that this should not spread, is, I think, about a reassertion of a particular masculinized form of violence that is very threatened by women's forms of care work and a feminist ethic of care that is about producing these communities that shows that is a model of India, not as this us versus them kind of a thing. So to me, it's less about the sort of explicit statement of we share some syncretic idea of, but it's instead about simply bodies together showing that we can overcome these deeply sedimented legacies of exclusion.
Audrey, one of the things you highlighted, which I thought was very interesting, and I'm sure a lot of people saw it on social media when the Hindu gentleman went up on the mosque, the masjid, and pulled down the flag, saffron flag. Do you know of other, and there's been other individuals who've come out in media who have, someone who saved a Muslim person who was being burned, and et cetera. This has come out in the media. Do you know of other movements of in a Hindu nature coming together as Hindus to oppose what's going on in an organized way, even in Kashmir as well, since there are Hindus in Kashmir?
Right. So I would say there are relatively few Hindus left in Kashmir, right, owing to events starting around 20 years ago. But I think you see sort of Hindu pushback against Hindutva on all sorts of levels. You certainly see it on sort of an individual kind of, heroism level. Let me open up my home, let me climb up this mosque. Especially early on in some of the anti-CAA NRC protests, it was Hindus and Muslims bye-bye, right? Marching side by side in the streets.
Brother.
And that has been really great to see. For a long time, when at least when I taught Hindutva, I would always be very careful to say that, the majority of Hindus want nothing to do with Hindutva. And I'm not clear where we are in the majority-minority tipping at this point, but it is still safe to say that a whole lot of Hindus vehemently dislike and hate Hindutva. And for good reason, right? It is a violent political ideology that is trying to take a glorious and long-lived and diverse religious tradition and just reduce it, right, to hatred alone, in a very sort of modern fascist way. In terms of specific, sort of groups fighting back, let me just mention a couple in the United States, since we are in New Jersey and sort of speaking in an American context. So one that has been around for a little while now is this group Sadhana, right, that does protests and pushback and advocacy work. Another much more recent one is a group of students that sort of just completed this major set of protests across nearly 24 American campuses, wholly against Hindutva. Which is very interesting. And, these sorts of movements are pushing back against the sort of spread of saffron ideology in the United States through groups like the HSS and their affiliates, through Seva International, right, and groups that sort of peddle soft Hindutva as a way to essentially try to radicalize Hindus here. So I think it's great to see this pushback and to see people becoming, politically aware and sort of organizing in new ways.
That's good, and I understand your concern about saying you don't know what that percentage is anymore because Modi won in a landslide. So
yes, a historic landslide.
Right. So Angie, I don't want to leave you out of the conversation. So one thing you said that I want to do a little pushback and then ask you a general question. When you were describing the Uyghur Muslims, you described them as moderate, and is that kind of this recognition, this implicit kind of, I think many Muslims feel that they have to, explain, I'm a moderate Muslim or they're moderate Muslim, therefore they're acceptable Muslims. I was wondering why you use that term, moderate Muslims, when you describe the Uyghurs.
Sure. So before I actually address that specific question, I wanted to return to an initial question that you asked regarding Trump in India. Sure. An interesting observation in that regard is the situation or crisis that has recently arisen in Kashmir, specifically the use of citizenship law to marginalize a minority Muslim community in Kashmir. And how that kind of is linked to the Muslim ban that was passed here in the United States by the Trump administration. Also an immigration law that is also used to marginalize a religious minority community. And how that is further linked to the use of citizenship laws in the context of Burma. And the fact that a 1982 citizenship law refused to grant citizenship to the Rohingya in Burma, casting them as a stateless group, further marginalizing and allowing so many other human rights violations to emanate by virtue of the fact that they're stripped of any formal legal recognition in that country. And so I think, again, it speaks to this larger point about ripple effects. Not to mention that we are a global hegemon, and so when we do institutionalize various forms of discrimination, religious, racial, ethnic discrimination, by use of immigration laws or any kinds of laws, policies, and practices, realizing that it will help reinforce similar discrimination in other contexts as well, right? And that this isn't necessarily new. It's part of a larger trend. It's just shameful when it occurs in the most powerful democratic society in the world, when we've seen these kinds of practices happening in authoritarian regimes. So I did want to mention that.
And mostly unchecked.
Correct. And I think what was most striking with respect to Trump's visit to India is the fact that Amnesty International, which is a reputable human rights organization, as we all know, actually issued a press release at that time, making these very connections between the citizenship law passed adversely affecting the Muslim population in India to the Muslim ban that was implemented under the Trump administration. I also just added the citizenship law in the Burmese context because there are obvious parallels and similarities. But beyond that, with respect to your question about characterizing the Uyghur Muslims as moderate, I think it's a direct response to Beijing's consistent characterization of the Uyghurs as radical Muslims.
Okay, so it was intentional.
It was very
Was
intentional.
it like a defensive posture? Or
No,
was
I think it was intentional, and it's also a trend in characterization shared by other academics. So I've read a lot of the literature written about the Uyghur Muslims. And as I mentioned, I teach a number of classes each semester where I incorporate discussions regarding the Uyghurs in various contexts. And so I think that it's really a response to the consistent and discriminatory characterization by Beijing of this particular minority group in order to justify their repressive policies. If you can convince the majority of the population that a minority constitutes a threat culturally, not to mention in terms of national security, you will achieve relative silence when you are persecuting that group for decades. And we've seen this in so many different contexts, whether it's in the context of Myanmar, whether it's in the context of China, or whether it's in the context of certain European countries. So again, there's sort of there are common threads, and I think one of the benefits of having a symposium like this, which forces a discussion regarding global Islamophobia, is being able to take a step back and recognize what some of these common threads are, despite the
differences in context,
the geographic diversity, and thinking strategically about how to confront and challenge these discourses and these trends and practices and policies in a way that's not so divided, right? So that is just my response.
Thank you. I have like a bunch of questions, but I know we're in a time crunch. We have an internet question, Angie, it's for you. Are there groups in China advocating for the Uyghur population within?
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. There is actually a very strong Uyghur diaspora network based here in the United States that advocates on behalf of the Uyghurs. And I should mention, the United States passed a law in 1998 called the International Religious Freedom Act, and it mandated that the U.S. State Department issue an annual report analyzing trends in international religious freedom around the world. And since the beginning of their doing so, their very first report, I believe, was issued in 1999. There was a congressional hearing that was organized, coordinated, and at that congressional hearing where the first report was presented, there was a witness on behalf of the Uyghur community, and they were associated with one of these organizations that advocates on behalf of the Uyghurs. So there are a number of very effective strong organizations advocating and working on behalf of the Uyghur community based here.
They're the diaspora or within China?
They are diaspora, but they do have, unfortunately, they do have many of the members of these organizations have family members who still live in the autonomous region in China who have in fact been persecuted as a result of the activities of their relatives here in the United States. And this has been a matter of congressional inquiry. Individuals have testified regarding this. For example, there are a number of Uyghur Americans who work as journalists with the Radio Free Asia. And because of the coverage that these journalists have given to the crisis involving the Uyghur in China, family members in the autonomous region have disappeared. There are very vocal, outspoken activists, for example, one by the name of Rabia Khader, who's very well recognized, and she's consistently working with the State Department and members of Congress regarding this issue. And this has really become a bipartisan issue as far as Congress, which is, really impressive for Congress today. But essentially, she has, she works with these high-level officials on this issue. They disappeared both her sons, who were living in the autonomous region. So in response to your question, there are very strong organizations, Uyghur organizations that represent members of the diaspora community, but with severe implications for those who remain in the autonomous region.
Yeah, there's a recent New York Times article, or New York Times Magazine a couple Sundays ago also that highlighted the risks that the diaspora families are suffering. Again, lots of questions, but I know that we have to take a break before we come back for our third panel. But I'm going to jump another. Yeah, okay, we do. We have 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. I can ask my other question. I'm going to look at Audrey first. What do you think? I understand the Citizenship Act in India is before the Indian Supreme Court right now. And supposedly an opinion is supposed to come out any day. What are your thoughts on what you think is going to happen regarding the constitutionality of the Citizenship Act?
So, okay, I would say I'm not a legal scholar.
Okay.
And I also, historians, we do the past, we don't do the future. What I can tell you is that the Indian court system has really folded very strongly in the last 6 months, especially. And I mean, they're just rubber stamping the Hindu to us stuff right now, like left and right. The verdict that I'm most familiar with is the Ayodhya verdict, which came out in November, I believe, of 2019. And so when the Babri Masjid was destroyed by a Hindu mob, extrajudicial violence, a couple thousand Muslims ended up dead, and the riots after that happened in 1992. There's been litigation since. The Ayodhya verdict finished this off, put all the cases together. And the end result is that the Indian Supreme Court said that the Hindu litigants can build a Ram Mandir, they can build a Ram temple over the rubble of the Babri Masjid for no really good reason other than Hindu majoritarian sentiments, right? And I mean, it's an appalling legal decision. It's also an appalling sort of cultural decision. It's incredibly insensitive to Muslims. That's just one example. There have been other examples as well. So in general, I would say if you're looking to the Indian courts as your savior, I don't think you have a great deal of hope right now.
And that's, as a historian, I wanted you to forecast based on what has been occurring in the last several months. So thank you. Asher, then I have another question for you. You talked about these Muslim areas, environments that are being labeled as Pakistani. What else is the significance of labeling it as particularly Pakistani, not just Muslim or using some other label, identity, but actually invoking the neighboring country that was, very violently divided by the British? So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it does different work in different contexts. I would say that it's often not necessarily, it's not always used in malice, I would say. Like you'll see examples of it in newspaper contexts where they're just literally just describing sort of Muslim majority areas as little Pakistans. But there are, I think, far deeper implications of that. In the case of Shaheen Bagh in particular, the accusation that it was being run by sort of Pakistani design somehow is an attempt to discredit the agency of the women who were doing the organization. It couldn't be them doing this. It could only be this outside agent. More generally, I think discursively, its effect is to suggest that in part it's to justify the denial of services and rights and benefits to those neighborhoods by suggesting that they're almost closer to being under the sovereign command of a foreign agent, a foreign power. So therefore, why should we extend to them the sort of services and benefits when someone else presumably is somehow indirectly supporting them? They're not always called Little Chote Pakistan. They're sometimes called Little Bangladeshes, or so it's often just
which was East Pakistan.
Which is East Pakistan. So they're basic designators for Muslim majority ghettoized spaces in India more generally. But it's an attempt to deeply stigmatize and criminalize often neglected neighborhoods and to attribute their own spatial relegation to their own positionality, their own identity, their own histories, rather than those of the state and those of forces that are actively excluding them. And often I should say that this is really a sort of post-1980s trend of deepening Muslim ghettoization. There's, all of the big metro cities have examples of them. So Jamia Nagar in Delhi is a big one. Mumbai in Bombay, Mumbai is another one that really took off after the 1992 the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and then the riots that ensued that wreaked, extreme havoc and very disproportionate violence on Muslim communities. So that pattern is something that also gets imprinted upon sort of everyday routines increasingly as well. So the real estate industry, not as if it's a coherent thing, but the systematic denial of rental properties or the ability to purchase land outside of those ghettoized spaces is now the norm. It's been completely normalized. And I think just to sort of acknowledge that there has in certain ways been a hardening of communal tension, part of it is that it's a sense of being blamed for everything that leads to maybe a diminishing of more sort of Sufi style tendencies towards Wahhabists. We have to acknowledge that there has been an increase of that in some cities, and part of it is this sense that of literally abandonment by the state. So I think there is a real fear in those neighborhoods of possible retribution, of fear of future violence that this language really, I think, is stoking in all kinds of really, really dangerous ways.
What popped in my head is the next symposium maybe should be Islamophobia within the Muslim community. But we'll take that at another time. Angie, you mentioned China describing the Uyghurs as a religious threat, not necessarily describing it outright, but as a religious threat since the majority Han, the government of China, is atheist. Is there any other religious minority community that is having this sort of persecution? And then second question, it's coming to light that there are various natural resources in the province where the Uyghurs are. What is the true motivation? Which I'm kind of giving you the answer that perhaps I think or that others think, that there's perhaps another motivation for the Chinese to kind of take control of that area.
Yeah, I think those are two great questions. With respect to your first question regarding other groups, it's worth noting that there is another Muslim minority group that exists in China called the Hu Muslims, who also are persecuted. However, they are ethnically similar because they're part of the Han ethnic majority group, whereas the Uyghurs are both religiously and culturally different because of their Turkic ancestral ties. And so they are not persecuted as much as the Uyghurs, but they still confront various challenges to their right to religious freedom. In addition to that particular Muslim group, which is not based in the Uyghur Autonomous Region, there are Christians that are persecuted by Beijing, as well as Buddhists who are also experience disfavored treatments. And so what we see here is, again, this intersection of ideologies and practices grounded in oppression. But it is also generally understood and accepted both by policymakers as well as in academic literature that the group that receives the most disfavored treatment is in fact the Uyghur Muslims. That is why we now see internment camps where 1 million Uyghurs are in fact forced to reside and undergo the horrible treatment that I described. So that's with respect to your first question. Second, yes, I intentionally included that reference to natural resources when describing.
Which Audrey also mentioned with Kashmir.
Yeah.
So we don't have enough time to get into some of
yes,
these.
I mean, it is very significant because it helps explain why from the 1950s, they're promoting, this Han migration policy and attempting to displace the Uyghur majority population with relative success. And it is because of the fact that this is a region that is rich with oil reserves, minerals, and other natural resources. I should also say that in addition to having economic strategic interest, there's also significance in where it is situated geographically. It is close to Central Asia, and it is also close to the West. And so, there's geographic significance with respect to the Xinjiang autonomous region, in addition to the economic interests, which is key in terms of Beijing's priorities right now. So, good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, my panelists, Asher, Audrey, Angie. We're just going informal with your first names. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for those of you who are tuning in via the internet. We are going to take a break right now, and we are going to move into our third panel of Islamophobia in a European context. Thank you very much.